We tend to remember her through him, through the height, the ambition, the empire, but she was there long before any of that, standing on a different island under a different sky, already shaped by a world that gave women very little room to move. Her name was Marie-Joseph Rose Tacher de la Pagerie. She would later be called Josephine. And the distance between those two names, the girl born in Martinique and the woman crowned Empress of France, is one of the most extraordinary journeys in modern history. I've spent a long time tracing that journey. Using modern artificial intelligence tools, I work to reconstruct the paintings, engravings, and written records that survive from her era, shifting perspectives, zooming into details, entering moments that were once frozen still. It allows me to see what the history books often skip: the texture of a dress, the layout of a room, the way light fell through a window on an ordinary morning. This work comes from a genuine place. I am deeply interested in the lives of women throughout history, not as spectacle, but as careful, respectful observation of what it truly meant to be alive in a time not your own. Picture a plantation house on the southwest coast of Martinique. The year is around 1770. The air is thick with heat and salt from the Caribbean Sea, and the sound of sugarcane rustling in the wind is constant, a low, dry whisper that never entirely disappears. The Tacher de la Pagerie estate at Trois-Îles is not a grand residence. It is modest, somewhat worn, the kind of place where wealth is more spoken of than seen. A girl moves through this house. She is quick and curious, with dark eyes and a wide smile she will later learn to conceal, because a smile that shows the teeth was considered unrefined, and her teeth, damaged perhaps by the tropical climate or childhood illness, would become a source of quiet self-consciousness for the rest of her life. Her name is Rose. She is 7, maybe 8 years old. She has no idea what France looks like. She has never seen snow. Rose grew up in a household shaped by colonial plantation life, a system built on sugar and slavery, and her family, though not wealthy by French standards, depended entirely on that structure. Her father, Joseph Gaspard Tacher de la Pagerie, was a lieutenant in the French Navy, often absent, often in debt. Her mother, Rose Claire de Verger de Sanois, managed what little there was to manage. The plantation was damaged by a hurricane in 1766 when Rose was just 3 years old, and the family never fully recovered financially. This early instability, the constant awareness that comfort could be swept away, left a mark on her that would define her relationship with money and with security for the rest of her life. She learned early that belonging to the right world was not enough. You had to perform belonging, carefully, continuously, without rest. She was educated locally, first by her aunt, then for a time at a convent school in Fort Royal, the island's capital. She learned what girls of her class were meant to learn: some music, some French manners, the broad outlines of a world she had not yet entered. And she waited, as girls in her position often did, for the arrangement that would determine the rest of her life. In 1779, Rose sailed to France for the first time. She was 16 years old. She crossed the Atlantic not for love, not for adventure, but for a contract. The Tacher family had a connection to the noble Beauharnais family of France, and an arrangement had been made. Rose would marry Alexandre de Beauharnais, a young French viscount. It was the kind of match that colonial families like hers worked for: a bridge to the metropole, a securing of status, a foot inside a door that would otherwise remain closed. Paris, in 1779, was gleaming and cold in equal measure. Cold in climate, cold in its social calculations. Rose arrived wearing clothes that were already slightly out of fashion, her French accented by the Caribbean, her manners colonial in ways she could not yet fully understand. Alexandra noticed he was educated, ambitious, and proud, already moving in the circles of Enlightenment Paris, and his new wife, he decided quickly, was not quite what he had hoped for. They married in December 1779. She was 16, he was 18. The ceremony took place in Noisy-le-Grand, east of Paris. The dress she likely wore, we can reconstruct it from period engravings of court fashion, would have been a formal French robe à la Française, wide pannier hoops beneath a silk skirt, a fitted bodice with lace at the sleeves, her dark hair powdered or piled high in the fashion of the time. It was a costume, as much as a garment, designed to show that she belonged to a world she had only just entered. It is difficult from this distance not to feel the weight of that room. A girl of 16, dressed in borrowed elegance, marrying a stranger in a country that was not yet hers. The marriage was not happy. Alexandra was frequently away, dismissive when present, and openly unfaithful. He wrote her a letter, not long after their marriage, criticizing her lack of education and refinement in precise, cutting terms. For a young woman far from home, with no independent income and no recourse, those words were not just unkind, they were a kind of verdict. She responded by educating herself. She read, she sought out teachers, she paid close attention to how Parisian women moved, spoke, dressed, and navigated rooms. Slowly, deliberately, she rebuilt herself in the image of a world that had first rejected her. They had 2 children, Eugène, born in 1781, and Hortense, born in 1783. And then, effectively, the marriage ended. Not legally, not yet, but in every practical sense. Alexandra separated from her and went on with his life. Rose was left in Paris with 2 small children, a title she had not quite earned, and a future that was entirely uncertain. The revolution came in 1789, and it changed everything, including what it meant to be a woman with a title. In the space of a few years, the world Rose had worked so hard to enter simply dissolved. The aristocracy she had married into was now suspect, sometimes fatal. The powdered wigs, the silk panniers, the elaborate court rituals, all of it was suddenly dangerous to display. Alexandre de Beauharnais, her estranged husband, tried to navigate the revolution by embracing it. He became a general in the Revolutionary Army, served with some distinction, and for a time it seemed his name might survive the terror that was consuming the nobility around him. It did not. In 1794, at the height of the Reign of Terror, he was arrested. Rose was arrested shortly after, on the basis of her association with him and her aristocratic connections. She was imprisoned in Les Carmes, a former Carmelite convent in Paris that had been converted into a detention center. The cells were damp and crowded. The smell of the Seine was never far away. Women of various backgrounds, some nobility, some not, shared the space, waiting. Everyone inside Les Carmes knew what waiting might mean. The guillotine was active, lists were read aloud, names were called. Alexandre de Beauharnais was executed on July 23, 1794. Rose heard of it inside those walls. She survived the terror in a way that cannot be entirely explained by luck. She was social, resourceful, and precise in her relationships, qualities that, in another era, might have been called political skill. She was released in August 1794, just days after the fall of Robespierre ended the worst of the executions. She was 31 years old, a widow, deeply in debt, with 2 children and a social network that was rebuilding itself cautiously around the ruins of the old world. In the following months, she moved through the salons of Thermidorian Paris, a new social order emerging from the chaos, faster, more fluid, less concerned with birth than with connection. She wore the fashionable muslin dresses of the Directory period, thin, almost transparent white fabric, draped in the Greco-Roman style that had replaced the heavy court silks of the Ancien Regime. She wore her dark hair short and curled, in the mode called à la Titus. She was, by every account, gracious, warm, and magnetic. And she was looking with careful eyes for stability. She found it, or rather it found her, in the form of a young Corsican general with extraordinary eyes and restless ambition. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was 26. She was 32. Napoleon was obsessed with her. His letters from the Italian campaign in 1796, written while commanding one of the most successful military advances in modern European history, are some of the most fevered love letters ever recorded. He wrote to her daily, sometimes twice daily, in language that swings between adoration and desperation. She was, to him, an anchor in the world. She was also, to him, a kind of social credential, a Frenchwoman, a widow of a revolutionary general, a woman who knew how to enter a room. She married him on March 9th, 1796, in a civil ceremony. She arrived late. The registry listed her age as 4 years younger than she actually was, a small falsification she maintained throughout their relationship. He was already away with the army 2 days later. It was, in many ways, a marriage conducted at a distance. His desire constant, her affection more measured, her attention sometimes elsewhere. At Malmaison, the chateau she purchased west of Paris in 1799, we can see her most clearly as herself. She chose the property, negotiated the price, supervised the renovations, and designed the gardens. Over 300 varieties of roses, gathered from across Europe and beyond, filling the grounds with color and scent. The rooms inside were furnished in the Empire styles, then emerging, clean classical lines, mahogany and gilded bronze, crimson and gold fabrics, walls hung with landscapes and portraits. She collected art with genuine passion and considerable knowledge. She filled the greenhouses with exotic plants from Martinique, from Africa, from the Cape. At Malmaison, she was not Napoleon's wife. She was herself. The gardens at Malmaison were not a hobby. They were an argument for autonomy, for taste, for a life that could not be entirely defined by someone else's ambitions. But the political pressures of the empire were always present. Napoleon needed an heir. Josephine had not conceived a child with him, and as the years passed, his family, who had resented her from the beginning, pressed more urgently for divorce. She had been crowned Empress of the French at Notre Dame in December 1804 in a ceremony of extraordinary grandeur. The painter Jacques-Louis David recorded it in his enormous canvas. Josephine kneeling before Napoleon who is placing the crown upon her head rather than allowing the Pope to do so. She wears white satin, heavily embroidered with gold, a crimson velvet mantle edged with ermine over her shoulders, a diadem of diamonds and cameos upon her dark hair. She looks composed. She always looked composed. The divorce came in December 1809. Napoleon announced it. She agreed to it publicly, and at a dinner shortly after wept openly, one of the few times her private grief made its way into the historical record. She retained the title of Empress Malmaison and a substantial annual income. She was 46 years old. The crown she had worn for 5 years was gone. The man who had written to her from the battlefields of Italy was gone too, in the way that mattered most. Josephine died at Malmaison on May 29, 1814. She was 50 years old. The cause is recorded as pneumonia, contracted during a walk in the gardens with Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who had come to visit her following Napoleon's first abdication. She had outlasted the empire by only a few weeks. She was buried at the church of Saint-Pierre-Saint-Paul in Rue Malmaison, near her beloved house, surrounded by the roses she had spent 15 years cultivating. Napoleon, on Elba, is said to have wept when he received the news. What do we do with a life like hers? She moved from a struggling plantation in Martinique to the throne of France through a combination of survival, reinvention, and social intelligence that is genuinely remarkable, and almost never credited as such. She is remembered mostly as Napoleon's wife, mostly through his obsession, mostly in the shadow of his ambition, the island girl, the prisoner, the widow who rebuilt herself, the woman who created Malmaison and filled it with roses from every corner of the world. These versions of her are harder to find. But they are there. In the letters, in the inventories of her wardrobe, in the botanical records of her gardens, in the accounts of the people who worked for her and with her, in the reconstructed paintings and engravings where I can zoom in close enough to see the embroidery on her sleeve or the particular way she held her shoulders. She is there, if you look, and what strikes me, each time I return to her story, is how familiar the shape of it feels, the pressure to perform a version of yourself that the world finds acceptable, the negotiation between private feeling and public expectation, the work of building something of your own inside a life that was largely organized around someone else's needs. These are not problems that disappeared with the 19th century. The crown is taken, the roses remain, and some women are remembered not for what was done to them, but for what they quietly, stubbornly built. If there is a place, a moment, or a woman from history you would like to see reconstructed next, leave it in the comments. Every story we recover is one that was almost lost.